My name is Nora Castillo. I'm 34, and I've managed project timelines worth more than most houses in my hometown without ever once raising my voice in a boardroom. A year after I married Eli Webb, my family threw a barbecue for my father's 60th birthday. Eli showed up in the same faded work jacket he always wore, the one with the torn pocket he refused to replace, and he brought a bottle of wine that cost $11, because it was what we could afford. My brother Kyle held the bottle up to the light like he was inspecting evidence. My mother, Deborah, watched from the kitchen doorway with the tight smile she saved for moments she found embarrassing. And my father, Ray Castillo, who'd spent 28 years at Greystone Industrial Services and never let anyone forget it, looked at my husband across the picnic table and said the line my family would repeat at every gathering for the next 3 years. "Tell me again what you do, Eli, because I keep forgetting and I think that might be the problem." Everybody laughed. Eli didn't. He just picked up his paper plate, sat down at the end of the table where nobody was sitting, and ate quietly while my family talked about him 4 feet away like he was furniture that had been delivered to the wrong house. I didn't correct them. I didn't defend him the way I should have. And I didn't say the one thing I knew that would have stopped every laugh at that table cold. Because Eli had asked me not to. 3 years later, my family found out who my husband really was. Not because he told them, and not because I broke my promise. They found out because my father's company announced a restructuring, and the name on the ownership document was one they'd been making fun of since the night of the $11 wine. What happened in the room where my brother finally read that name out loud is the reason I'm sitting here now, 5 years later, telling you any of this. Welcome back to Calm Stories QX, where we share quiet stories about dignity, patience, and the moment someone finally stopped shrinking to fit a seat that was always too small for them. If you've ever watched someone you love get laughed at by the people who were supposed to welcome him, this one is for you. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from, and be sure to subscribe. Because the part where my father realizes he's been clocking in every morning for the man he wouldn't shake hands with at Thanksgiving is coming, and you don't want to miss it. Let me take you back to the beginning, not the barbecue. Before Eli. Before I understood the difference between a family that loves you and a family that approves of you, and how you can lose your whole life confusing the two. I grew up in Milford, Pennsylvania, a paper mill town that had outlived its mill and never quite found a second act. My father worked at Greystone Industrial Services, which handled commercial cleaning contracts, maintenance staffing, and facilities management for half the businesses in the Tri-County area. He started as a floor tech at 22 and worked his way up to regional operations supervisor by the time I was born. That title was the sun my family orbited. Everything in our house was measured against what Dad had achieved and what it cost him to achieve it. My mother kept his first Employee of the Month plaque framed above the kitchen table. Kyle followed him into the company straight out of high school and never looked back. My younger sister, Jess, married a man my parents liked specifically because he worked in the same industry. And then there was me. I'd gone to college on a scholarship, studied project management, moved to the city and got a job at a logistics firm where I coordinated supply chains for clients I couldn't name in public. I was good at it. The kind of good where people stop checking your work because they trust it. But none of that registered with my family the way Kyle's shift supervisor badge did, or the way Jess's husband bring beaver from the company distributor did. I had moved away. I had chosen a different path, and in a family where loyalty meant staying close enough to see the same water tower from your kitchen window, distance was its own kind of betrayal. My mother once said to me, during one of our Sunday calls, the thing that sat in my chest like a stone for years afterward, "You think you're better than this place, Nora. But this place is the reason you exist." She said it warmly. That was the part that cut the deepest. I didn't think I was better. I just wanted to be somewhere that measured me by what I built instead of where I stayed. But in Milford, wanting more was the same thing as wanting out. And wanting out meant you thought you were above. I carried that for a long time. The quiet guilt of being the one who left. The way I softened my voice when I talked about my job, never saying the salary out loud, never mentioning the corner office, always describing my work in the most modest terms I could find so nobody at the family table would feel like I was showing off. I had spent my whole adult life shrinking myself down to fit in the chair they saved for me at holidays, and I'd gotten so good at it that I didn't even notice I was doing it anymore. Then I met Eli, and the shrinking stopped. I met Eli Webb at a hardware store in the city on a Saturday afternoon, And I know how unromantic that sounds, but hear me out. I was buying shelf brackets for a bookcase I was building myself because I'd watched a YouTube video and decided I was a carpenter now. Eli was in the same aisle, buying what looked like half the store's inventory of industrial fasteners. I dropped a bracket, he picked it up. That was the whole beginning. Building something, he asked. A bookcase, maybe, if I don't destroy the wall first, he smiled. It was a slow smile, the kind that starts in the eyes and takes its time reaching the mouth. And I noticed two things about him in that first 30 seconds. His hands were calloused, and his jacket, a faded olive work jacket with a torn left pocket, looked like it had been worn every day for a decade. I could help, he said. If you want. I'm pretty good with walls. He helped me build the bookcase that afternoon. Then he stayed for pizza. Then he called me the next day, not to ask me out, but to tell me he'd realized he'd put one of the brackets slightly off level, and it was going to bother him until he fixed it. He came back and fixed it. Then I asked him to dinner. Over the next several months, I learned who Eli Webb was, or at least who he appeared to be. He drove a 10-year-old truck. He wore the same rotation of 3 shirts. He lived in a modest apartment on the east side of the city where the rent was reasonable and the neighbors were quiet. He described himself as being in facilities management, which I took to mean he was a maintenance worker or maybe a building superintendent. He never talked about money. Never complained about not having it. Never seemed to want anything that cost more than a meal and good company. What he did talk about was systems, how buildings worked, why certain companies failed at maintaining their infrastructure and how that failure rippled outward into worker morale, safety records, and profit margins. He talked about it the way I talked about supply chains, with a kind of obsessive, quiet expertise that made me realize this wasn't a man who cleaned floors for a living. This was a man who understood, from the ground up, how things were built and how they fell apart. But I didn't push. I'd spent my whole life being pushed to explain myself, to justify my choices, to translate my life into terms my family would accept. I wasn't going to do that to someone else. So when Eli said he was in facilities management, I took it at face value. And when he paid for our dates in cash, always careful, always counting, I didn't ask why. 6 months in, I loved him. 9 months in, I knew I was going to marry him. And on the night, I told my mother his name, his job, and the truck he drove. The silence on the other end of the phone lasted long enough to become its own kind of sentence. A maintenance man, my mother said. He works in facilities management, Mom. Honey, your father manages facilities. This man cleans them. That was the first cut. Small, clean, delivered with the precision of a woman who'd been sharpening that particular knife her whole life. I brought Eli to Milford 2 months later to meet my family, and what happened that weekend is the foundation everything else was built on. My father met Eli in the driveway with a handshake that lasted exactly 1 second shorter than it should have. I noticed because I noticed things like that. Handshakes, seating arrangements, the angle of someone's body when they're talking to a person they've already decided it doesn't matter. My job is logistics. I read rooms the way some people read weather, and the forecast that weekend was cold with a chance of humiliation. Kyle was worse. He didn't even try to hide it. So, Eli, he said at dinner, leaning back in his chair with the confidence of a man who'd never left the town that loved him. Nora says you're in facilities. What's your territory? Mostly tri-state, Eli said. Wherever the work takes me. Uh-huh. Kyle exchanged a look with my father, the kind of look men share when they've agreed on something without speaking. And what does that actually mean, day to day? Whatever needs fixing, Eli said. He said it simply, not defensively, just a man describing his work without decorating it. And I watched my family hear the word fixing and file it in the same drawer where they kept their assumptions about people who worked with their hands instead of their titles. My mother served Eli the smallest pork chop. I noticed that too. She'd never done it to anyone else who'd sat at that table. But she did it to him the way you'd portion a meal for someone you expected to leave early. After dinner, on the porch, I overheard my father say something to Kyle that I was clearly not meant to hear. She could have had anyone, my father said. And she picks a guy who fixes toilets for a living. Kyle laughed. Maybe she'll figure it out. She's smart enough. Just got bad taste. I stood behind the screen door and felt my hands shake. Not from sadness, but from the specific rage that comes when the people you love reveal what they actually think of the person you've chosen. I almost said something. I almost walked out there and told them exactly what I thought of their small, measured cruelty. But Eli found me first. He was standing behind me. He'd heard everything. His face was calm, the kind of calm I'd later learn was load-bearing, the kind that holds up a whole building of feeling without showing the weight. "Don't," he said quietly. "They're talking about you like I know what they're saying, and I know what I am. Those two things don't have to match." I looked at him. This man in his faded jacket, standing in my parents' hallway, absorbing their contempt like it was weather. "It doesn't bother you?" I asked. "It bothers me that it hurts you," he said. "But what they think of me doesn't change what I know." I didn't understand what he meant then. I thought he was just being stoic, being kind, being Eli. It would be almost 2 years before I learned what he actually knew. We got married at the courthouse on a Wednesday. Eli wore a navy suit he'd bought off a clearance rack. I wore a white dress I already owned. Our witness was a colleague of mine named Priya, who cried through the whole thing and took 11 photos on her phone. My family didn't come. Not because I didn't invite them. I did. My mother said she had a church thing. My father said he couldn't take the day off. Kyle didn't respond at all. Jess sent a card with a gift certificate to a restaurant chain and a note that said, "Congrats, I guess," with a smiley face that somehow made it worse. They weren't angry. They were something harder to fight. They were unimpressed. They'd decided that my marriage was a phase, that Eli was temporary, and that eventually I'd come home with a better story and a better man. Over the next year, the comments settled into a rhythm. At Thanksgiving, my father asked Eli if he was still fixing things or had he moved up yet. Kyle's wife, Tammy, asked me in the kitchen if we were doing okay financially, with the careful pity of a woman who'd been coached. My mother pulled me aside at Christmas and pressed an envelope into my hand with $200 inside and whispered, "For emergencies, sweetheart, I worry about you." I tried to give it back. She closed my hand around it and gave me a look so full of loving condescension that I wanted to throw up. And through all of it, Eli sat at the end of the table, quiet and unbothered, eating whatever was put in front of him and letting my family believe he was exactly what they decided he was. The line they kept coming back to was always some version of the same thing. Different words, same meaning, served at every gathering like a side dish nobody ordered but everybody ate. "When are you going to get a real job, Eli?" My brother said it at the 4th of July. My father said it at my mother's birthday lunch. Jess's husband, Craig, said it once at New Year's Eve and laughed so hard at his own delivery that he spilled beer on Eli's sleeve and didn't apologize. Eli never corrected them, never argued. Never said a single word in his own defense. And every start to, he'd find my hand under the table, squeeze it once, and give me the smallest shake of his head. I hated it. I hated watching him absorb it. I hated the patience he showed to people who didn't deserve it. One night, driving home from a visit where my father had spent 20 minutes lecturing Eli about financial planning, while my mother nodded along, like she was watching a sermon, I finally broke. "Why won't you let me tell them?" I asked. Eli was driving, his eyes stayed on the road. "Tell them what?" he said. "The truth. About you. About what you actually do. About what you actually have." He was quiet for a long time, long enough for 2 exits to pass. "Because I need to know something first," he said. "I need to know who they are when they think I have nothing. I already know who they'd be if they knew the rest." What does that mean? It means the people who matter don't need to see the number to see me. And the people who need the number were never really looking. I didn't fully understand it then. But I would. Here's what I knew about Eli Webb that my family didn't, and what he'd asked me, from the very beginning, to keep to myself. Eli's grandfather had started a small industrial cleaning company in the 1970s. 1 truck, 2 employees, contracts with local warehouses and manufacturing plants. When his grandfather retired, Eli's father expanded it into a full facilities management operation. And when Eli's parents died in a car accident the year Eli turned 23, he inherited the whole thing. The company was called Greystone Industrial Services. The same company my father had worked at for 28 years. The same company my brother Kyle supervised shifts for. The same company that paid for my mother's kitchen renovation and my sister's husband's truck. Eli Webb owned it, not managed it, not invested in it. Owned it outright through a family trust that had been structured before he was born. He was the sole beneficiary, the sole decision maker, and the man whose signature appeared on every major contract, every payroll authorization, and every benefits package that kept my father's health insurance active. Eli had never set foot in the Milford office. The company was run day-to-day by a management team his father had built, led by a CEO named Martin Cross who'd been with the company for 2 decades, and who reported directly to Eli through quarterly calls and annual reviews. Nobody at the Milford level knew who owned Greystone. The company had always been structured that way, even under Eli's parents. The ownership was held through a trust. The trust was managed through a corporate entity, and the corporate entity's name on the paperwork was Webb Holdings LLC. There was no Ellie Webb on the lobby wall, no family photo in the break room, no mention of the founder's grandson in the company newsletter. It was deliberate. It had always been deliberate. Eli's father had believed that the best way to know if a company was well run was to stay invisible. If they only behave because the boss is watching, he'd told Eli once, then you don't have a company, you have a performance. Eli had kept that philosophy. He wore the faded jacket. He drove the old truck. He lived modestly, not because he had to, but because he believed that comfort should be earned daily, not inherited once and coasted on forever. He donated more than half his income to causes he never talked about. He funded scholarships he never put his name on. And he paid himself a salary that was, by design, indistinguishable from what a mid-level facilities worker might earn. I'd learned all of this gradually. Not in one dramatic reveal, but in small pieces over months. A document left open on his laptop. A phone call I overheard with Martin Cross about a contract renewal. And finally, one night in our apartment, when Eli sat me down and told me the whole truth because he said I deserved to know before I married him. I'm not poor, he said. I've never been poor. But I need to know that you'd have married me either way. I would have, I said. I believe you, that's why I'm telling you. And then he asked me not to tell my family. Not because I'm ashamed, he said, but because the way they treat me right now is real. It's honest. They're showing me exactly who they are when they think I can't do anything for them. What if they never change? I asked. Then I'll know that too. So I kept quiet. For 3 years, through every small pork chop and every when are you going to get a real job and every $200 emergency envelope, I kept my mouth shut and let my family show us who they were. It was the hardest promise I ever kept. And then Greystone announced a restructuring, and the promise kept itself. The restructuring wasn't Eli's idea, it was Martin Cross's. After 20 years of steady growth, Greystone needed to modernize. New contracts required updated technology, better safety protocols, and a management structure that could scale. Martin proposed consolidating regional offices, upgrading training programs, and bringing in a new layer of accountability that would affect every employee from floor techs to regional supervisors. The restructuring would mean performance reviews, reassignments, and for some positions, redundancies. The kind of corporate change that makes people nervous because it forces them to prove their value instead of coasting on tenure. My father had been coasting for years. I didn't know that then. I learned it later from the restructuring documents Eli let me read. But Ray Castillo, regional operations supervisor, had been underperforming relative to his peers for the better part of a decade. His territory had the highest complaint rate, the lowest client retention, and the most safety incidents of any region in the company. He'd survived this long because nobody had been looking closely. And nobody had been looking closely because, under the old structure, nobody had to. The restructuring changed that. Martin Cross sent a company-wide email announcing the changes. It included, as these announcements always do, a reference to the ownership entity authorizing the restructuring. And for the first time in the company's history, that reference included a name. Per authorization from sole proprietor E. Webb and Webb Holdings LLC, the following organizational changes will take effect. Martin had included it for legal reasons, a formality. A line in a corporate email that most employees would skim past without reading. But my brother Kyle didn't skim. Kyle called me on a Thursday evening. I was making dinner. Eli was in the other room reading something on his laptop. Nora, Kyle said, and his voice had the tight, controlled quality of a man who's just discovered something and hasn't yet decided whether he's angry or afraid. Hey, Kyle. What's up? I need to ask you something and I need you to be straight with me. The owner of Greystone, E. Webb, Webb Holdings, is that? He stopped, started again. Is that Eli? The kitchen went very quiet. I looked through the doorway at my husband, who was sitting on the couch in his faded jacket, reading glasses low on his nose, a coffee mug balanced on his knee. He looked up and met my eyes, and I saw in his face that he'd heard the question, and that he'd been waiting for it for 3 years. I didn't answer Kyle right away. Kyle, I said carefully, I think you should come here, bring Mom and Dad, and Jess. Nora, answer the question. Come here, I said again, Saturday, all of you, and then we'll talk. He hung up without saying goodbye. I set the phone on the counter and looked at Eli. They know, I said. Eli took off his glasses, folded them, set them beside his coffee. Good, he said quietly. It was time. They arrived out on Saturday at noon, all of them. My father, my mother, Kyle, Jess, Craig, and Tammy. 6 people in 2 cars, pulling into the driveway of the house Eli and I had bought the previous year with cash, a house I'd told them we were renting because Eli had asked me to. My father was the first through the door. He looked around the house, at the hardwood floors and the kitchen island and the backyard through the French doors, and I watched him recalculate something. Nice place, he said, for a rental. It's not a rental, I said. My mother sat down in the living room without being invited to, the way she always did, as if every room she entered automatically belonged to her. Kyle stood by the mantel with his arms crossed. Jess and Craig took the love seat. Eli came downstairs. He was wearing the jacket, the same one he always wore around them. And I saw my father's eyes go to it the way they always did, with that familiar dismissal. Except this time there was something else underneath it, something afraid. Sit down, I said. Please. Nobody moved. Is it true? My father asked, and his voice was the voice of a man standing on a floor he suddenly suspects might not hold his weight. What did Kyle tell you? I asked. He said the owner of Greystone has the same last name as your husband. He said the restructuring documents reference someone named E. Webb. My father looked at Eli, at the faded jacket, at the calm face, at the man he'd 3 years calling a toilet fixer. Is it true? He asked again. Eli didn't answer immediately. He sat down across from my father, the way he'd sat at 100 family meals at the end, where nobody chose to sit. And he looked at my father with the same calm he'd carried through every insult, every dismissal, every when are you going to get a real job that this family had served him, like it was the only dish they knew how to make. Yes, Eli said. Greystone was my grandfather's company, then my father's, now it's mine. It's been mine since I was 23. The room didn't explode, it imploded. The silence was so dense I could hear the refrigerator humming 2 rooms away. My mother's hand went to her mouth. Kyle sat down, hard, on the arm of the couch, like his legs had made a decision his brain hadn't approved yet. And my father, who had walked into Greystone every morning for 28 years, who had built his entire identity around his position at that company, who had lectured Eli about financial planning and told him to get a real job while sitting at a table paid for by the company Eli owned, went completely white. That's not, my father started. It is, I said. You knew, my mother whispered. I've known since before we got married. And you didn't tell us? Kyle's voice was sharp now, the anger arriving faster than the shame. Ellie asked me not to. Every head in the room turned to Eli. Why? My father asked, and the word came out broken. Eli leaned forward, rested his forearms on his knees. Looked at my father the way you'd look at a patient you're about to give hard news to, with care but without flinching. Because I wanted to know who you were when you thought I had nothing, Eli said. I wanted to know if the people my wife loved would treat me like a person even when they believed I couldn't do anything for them. He paused. And now I know. My mother cried first. She cried the way people cry when they're not sure whether they're grieving or embarrassed, a confused, messy crying that she tried to hide behind her hands. Kyle stared at the floor. Jess had gone pale. Craig, who'd once spilled beer on Eli's sleeve and laughed, looked like he wanted to be absorbed into the love seat. And my father sat perfectly still, doing the math I could see forming behind his eyes. Every meal, every comment, every time he'd looked at Eli across a table and seen something beneath him. Every time he'd told his friends and coworkers that his daughter had married a man who fixed things for his living while he, Ray Castillo, had earned his way up through real work at a real company. A company Eli owned. A company where Eli's signature authorized the payroll that kept my father's lights on. The restructuring that was keeping my father up at night. The performance reviews. The potential redundancies. All of it had been set in motion by a document that bore the name of the man he'd served the smallest pork chop. The restructuring, my father said slowly. Is that our you? The restructuring is Martin's plan, Eli said. I approved it because the company needs it. It has nothing to do with you. It never had anything to do with you. But you could stop it. There it was, the pivot. The exact same pivot my family always made. The moment it became clear that Eli had something they needed, the disrespect evaporated and the calculations began. My father wasn't asking because he respected the answer. He was asking because he wanted to know if the man he'd mocked could now save him. Eli saw it too. I could tell by the way his jaw tightened, just slightly, the only crack in his calm I'd ever seen. No, Eli said, I won't stop it. The restructuring is good for the company, it's good for the employees. And honestly, Ray, it's good for you too, because the way things have been running in your region can't continue. The room temperature dropped. You're talking about my job, my father said. I'm talking about the company's future. That company is my life. I know, Eli said. That's why I need it to be run well. My father stood up. His face had gone from white to red, and his hands were trembling. And I could see the moment where pride and fear collided and produced something that looked a lot like rage. You sat in my house, my father said, his voice rising. You ate my food. You let me talk to you and the whole time you were. I was the same man the whole time, Eli said quietly. I was the same man when you handed me the smallest plate. I was the same man when Kyle asked me when I was going to get a real job. I was the same man when you told your friends your daughter married a toilet fixer. He stood up slowly. The only thing that's changed is what you know about me. And the fact that it changes how you're treating me right now is exactly why I didn't tell you. The room went silent. Eli looked at my father, at my mother, at my brother and sister, at the people who had spent 3 years measuring his worth by his jacket and his truck and his $11 wine. You mocked me because you thought I was broke, Eli said. And now you're standing in my house, asking me to save your job. I need you to sit with the distance between those two things. My father opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. What do you want? He finally asked. And Eli said the thing I will carry with me for the rest of my life. I wanted a family, he said. That's all I ever wanted. But you have to earn people like me the same way I earned everything else. Quietly, honestly, and without a number attached. He turned and walked into the kitchen. Not dramatically, not in anger. He just walked away the way a man walks away from a conversation he's already finished, even if the other people in the room haven't caught up yet. I looked at my family. My mother was still crying. Kyle had his head in his hands. Jess was staring at nothing. My father was standing in the middle of the room with the specific bewilderment of a man whose entire map has just been redrawn. I didn't comfort them. I didn't explain. I didn't soften. He asked me not to tell you, I said, because he wanted you to love him without a reason, and you couldn't do it. For 3 years, he gave you every chance to see him as a person, and you saw a pork chop size. I followed Eli into the kitchen. Behind me, I heard my father sit down heavily. And I heard my mother say his name, Ray, in the voice of a woman who has just realized that the person she's been pitying is the one she should have been learning from. I won't pretend everything healed that afternoon. It didn't. Trust that's been broken in small pieces over years doesn't mend in one conversation, and Eli knew that better than anyone. What happened instead was slower and, I think, more honest. My father went through the restructuring. His performance review was difficult. He was offered a lateral move, not a demotion, but not the title he'd clung to for decades. And he took it because he finally understood that the title had been protecting him from growth, not proving it. He never asked Eli for special treatment. I'll give him that. Whatever conversation he had with himself in the weeks after that Saturday, it changed something in him. He stopped talking about Greystone like it was his birthright and started talking about it like it was a job he needed to deserve. Kyle was harder. The pride ran deeper in him, and for months he avoided us entirely. When he did finally come to dinner, he sat next to Eli without speaking for the first 20 minutes. Then, out of nowhere, he asked Eli about the company's safety record and actually listened for the first time. I've been thinking about some things at my site, Kyle said. Some ways to improve the protocols. Would you look at them? Eli looked at him, measured the question, decided it was genuine. Sure, he said. Send them over. It was a beginning, my mother apologized. She did it privately, at my kitchen table, over coffee, 3 months after the reveal. She told me she was sorry for the pork chop, for the emergency envelope, for every time she treated Eli like a problem I'd eventually outgrow. I measured him wrong, she said. I measured him the way this town measures everybody, by what they have instead of who they are. You taught me to do the same thing, I said. It took Eli to unteach me. She nodded. She didn't argue. He's a good man, she said. He was always a good man, I said. You just couldn't see it past the jacket. She flinched, but she didn't look away, and that was something. There's a thing Eli said to me once, early in our marriage, that I didn't understand until the day my family sat in our living room and watched their whole story about us collapse. He said, the people who only see you when you're useful will always be surprised by who you really are. But the people who see you when you're invisible, those are the ones who were paying attention. My family hadn't been paying attention. They'd been performing. Performing approval for people who looked right, performed success the way they understood it, and stayed close enough to be counted. Eli didn't perform anything. He just was who he was, in every room, in every jacket, at every table. And the fact that his steadiness looked like poverty to them said everything about their eyes and nothing about his worth. Now I'll tell you where we are. Eli's eye still wears the jacket. I've stopped asking him to replace it. It's part of him now, the way my grandmother's ring is part of me. The one I twist when I'm thinking. The one that reminds me where I came from, without telling me where I have to stay. Greystone is thriving. The restructuring worked. My father is still there, quieter now, more careful. He and Eli talk once a month, not about the company, about fishing and weather, and the kind of ordinary things men talk about when they've finally stopped competing. Kyle sent Eli a text last Christmas that said, "Thanks for not firing me when you had every reason to." Eli responded with a thumbs up emoji, which is the most Eli response I can imagine. And we have a daughter now, Maya. She's 2. She has Eli's calm and my stubbornness, which is either the best or the most terrifying combination. Last Thanksgiving, my father held Maya on his lap and looked at Eli across the table. No pork chop ranking, no title measuring, no when are you going to get a real job. Just a man looking at another man and finally seizing him. "I'm sorry," my father said. "For all of it," Eli nodded. "I know," he said. "Pass the potatoes." And that was enough. Not because the apology wasn't needed, it was. But because Eli had never been waiting for an apology. He'd been waiting for something rarer. He'd been waiting for them to see him the way I'd always seen him. As someone worth knowing, even when there was nothing to gain. If you take one thing from my story, let it be this. The way someone treats the person they think can do nothing for them is the truest thing they'll ever tell you about themselves. Not their words, not their promises, not the version of themselves they perform for people with power. The truth is in the small pork chop, in the emergency envelope, in the question asked loudly enough for the table to hear, in the laughter that follows. And if you're the one being laughed at, if you're the one sitting at the end of the table in a faded jacket, holding a paper plate, letting people believe you're less than what you are, then hear me. You don't owe them the reveal. You don't owe them the number. You don't owe them the proof that you were worth respecting all along. But when the truth comes out, and it always does, you get to watch them sit with the distance between who they were to you and who they wish they'd been. That's my story. 3 years of the wrong name on the jacket, and one afternoon when the right name was on the document. And a family that learned, the hard way, that the man they wouldn't shake hands with was the one signing their checks. If someone in your life is being measured by what they have instead of who they are, share this with them. They need to hear it tonight. Drop a comment. Tell me where you're listening from. Type dignity if you've ever been underestimated. Hit subscribe because I've got more stories about quiet people who turned out to be holding up the whole room. And remember, the loudest person at the table is rarely the one holding the truth. Sometimes it's the quiet one at the end, in the torn jacket, eating from the smallest plate. Thanks for listening. I'll see you in the next one.